Good morning. Our brother Deadman is away, so I'll be filling in, and I have brought some material that in the past has been discussed, but we must review it. And what I do is go back and look over things talked about over the years and realize in the past when they were presented, they fit the context, the problems faced at the moment, current events. But how much more so even now? That's why I've selected to talk about individual liberty of conscience over against what we could call the collectivist tyranny of ignorance. I'll emphasize today, as time permits, the value of the individual. This is not radical individualism where I make my own way, you make yours. This is the individual seen in his or her proper context. I want to talk about a plea for the restoration of primitive Christianity. Those two things go together. Individualism and the return to the Bible, all the way back to the New Testament pattern. I want to talk about the Bible itself and show how that the restoration must be based upon it and upon it alone. And this provides then the setting for us to consider the liberty, the freedom that ought to prevail for every human, every individual conscience, to study the Bible for himself and to decide what is true according to the Bible. There is a profound moral and cultural effect that takes place based upon this point of departure, where we go from here, whether we accept collectivism or whether we accept individualism and the individual desire to study the Bible for himself. There is a yearning for human freedom, dignity, that is part of our race and has been from the beginning, but has been squelched for so long. And that has been the general trend throughout all of history with few exceptions. I want to talk about restorationism, and I've mentioned this before. It is not a new idea, but I think I cannot overemphasize it as the essence or the core of what we would think of as the original American ideal. Now, so far as this nation goes, this geopolitical sphere in which we live, we could say in one sense it's an accident of history, in one sense. In another sense, we could believe that God has providentially allowed us to be here. So we could say that as long as we follow His principles, we will be guided by Him, and that many of the blessings that come to us have come to us because of our willingness, more or less, to try to obey God, at least in the past. So in a sense, you could say it's an incidental, but it illustrates this country in which we live, the broader principles that have characterized all human history. We need to know history. I'm convinced we have not known enough. And that's why, because of the ignorance of our time, so many are falling into tyranny. Yes, the essence or the core of the American system begins with, we could say, the Reformation. And our brother is doing a great job talking about that period of history. The Reformation, the period to reform the corruption of the Roman Catholic Church from the medieval ages, which led to eventually Protestantism. And Protestantism, which led to, in some spheres, such as in England, Puritanism, which led to eventually a better break from the corruption of the past, a more consistent break from the corruption of the past that we would call separatism, separating completely, for example, from the Church of England, which was basically the British Catholic Church after some political changes took place. And then eventually, finally, here in this country, as well as in Scotland and other parts of the British Isles, and there's some evidence in other parts of the world, the evidence is not as strong there. We know more about the English-speaking world. The drive toward primitivism, toward a return to the primitive pattern of doing things, the original Christianity of the New Testament. So I want to talk about those things. I'll begin, it's kind of ambitious, with the book of Genesis chapter 10. Looking at verses 8 to 12, where there is the narrative of Nimrod, the mighty hunter. I've mentioned him in the past, and I've said I think Scripture portrays him as the archetypical, the very beginning, and thus symbolic tyrant over all of mankind. And since his day, many oppressors have followed in his steps. Some have thought that Genesis 10 is the beginning of civil government itself. I'm not sure. I would think that there's an implication that civil governments, as opposed to God's direct rule over a family, for example, must have begun in principle with Genesis chapter 9 and verse 6, where it is stated just after the flood, whosoever sheddeth man's blood, by man shall his blood be shed. You see, that implies a collection of men doing the execution in a righteous way, in a just way. So government is implied there, but that's not necessary for us to determine. We have then again with Nimrod back in Genesis 10, as we mentioned, the archetypical strong man and the representative of power politics for all time. Tyranny in government, rule by force, rule by violence. Now, the government inherently possesses force of arms. That's what makes it a civil government. So the threat of force is there against evildoers. But you see, this is God's ideal because of the necessity, since there are sinful men in the world, because of the necessity of controlling sinful men and protecting the innocent from sinful, criminal-minded men. Governments are ordained. They are required and are absolutely necessary. In Romans 13, verses 3 to 4, Paul talks about how basically a good government, an ideal civil government, is one that rewards the good and punishes the evildoer. So as long as it's fulfilling that role, it's basically doing what it's supposed to be doing. It's when it gets out of whack and things get out of place and the innocent suffer from the government and the evildoer is rewarded. That's when we have tyranny. That's when we have all kinds of mischief from sinful governments. So the governments are ideally to serve God's purpose, but they're made up of sinful humans. And sinful people do sinful things, obviously. This is why in Luke chapter 4, verses 5 and 6, we understand that the earthly governments at that time in Jesus' day were founded on violence. And they really were, as they are in most places of the world today. I think I've mentioned in the past how when Nimrod, mentioned in Genesis 10, first came to power, it was in the cradle of civilization itself, in the land of Shinar, which is a biblical way, an older way of referring to Babylon, modern-day Iraq. But that's the cradle of civilization itself. All civilization seems to have radiated out from that area of the world, as the Bible portrays, especially when we look at the table of the nations in Genesis chapters 10 and 11. We see in chapter 11 the Tower of Babylon, in Shinar, where they tried to build a one-world government under tyrannical forces, one or a few oppressive leaders. And God thwarted that purpose by confounding the languages so that various civilizations would have to move off into different geographical locales. This is God's way of showing He endorses the concept of a nation-state. And the concept of a nation, which is broader, the concept of a nation itself, than a state, which is a political entity. A nation, of course, refers to usually a common ethnic group, or a common culture, a common language, a common inherited set of ideals. Although when that disintegrates, there is no nation left, just pure political force that often finds it very difficult to rule over division. The Bible has often spoken about the sadness of human oppression and the evils thereof. Way back in Egypt, the children of Israel suffered. They were enslaved, in fact, Exodus 3 and verse 9. And God heard the oppression of His people, and He was concerned. Later on, when they come into the land of Canaan, the Israelites at first are obedient to God's arrangements. He does not have a central government. God was averse to the idea of a central government. I think human history is borne out. They're dangerous. They are dangerous. Central governments have too much power placed in them alone. So you have the judges who ruled in that early day in history in Israel. And the judges were more than just those who sat in judgment. They were warlords who would execute God's ways and execute judgment and justice in the world as it was necessary, and would lead God's people to freedom from the tyranny of the Philistines and others around them and their surrounding evil, idolatrous neighbors. So you have then this desire later on the part of Israel to be like their neighbors. They looked around and they saw they had kings. They had tyrants who ruled over them. And in a sense, it's kind of easy because you don't have any more responsibility to make hard decisions. Mr. Big will make all the decisions for you. You just give me enough bread and give me circuses. Let me have a little bit of entertainment in life, and I'll just enjoy myself in my little world and won't care about the big picture. I'll leave that in your hands, sire. This is the way the idolaters all around them had become accustomed to thinking. God's people were unique, though, because God had directly ruled over Israel. And through the judges who were only raised up temporarily to serve certain temporary purposes and then would kind of recede into the background in importance up until this time. God had ruled in that way with a confederation of tribes that were loosely held together. But then they wanted a king, and God warned them. You don't really want what you're asking for, but they clamored for it. In 1 Samuel chapter 8, we have the discussion where the prophet tells them, this is a bad thing you're requesting, but they demanded it, and God finally said, all right, the punishment you're going to get for asking for it is you're going to get it. And when they got it, they paid for it dearly. Then there was a strong man. You had Saul, who at the first was a righteous servant of the Lord. But power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. He had basically absolute political power in Israel, and he was corrupted to the core, absolutely, and oppressed the people. And then, of course, you had good King David who came along. Even he had his faults, but he tried to do his best, and that does show us what a government built on divine principles can accomplish and bring about justice and equity and fairness. Although it was not perfect, even under David, it was much better than under other circumstances. Then Solomon came along, who consolidated the power that David had acquired by military conquest all throughout the Middle East. And Solomon's reign was a reign of peace. But Solomon, in order to maintain that peace, had to have a large standing army. That required a great deal of taxation, more so than would have been needed for just the loose confederation arrangement that had existed earlier. And now we have the situation where there's so much oppression. Then comes the death of Solomon and the division of the kingdom between Rehoboam and Jeroboam. They were not brothers. They had similar names. They were not brothers, as some have thought. Rehoboam was a descendant of the Davidic line. Jeroboam was a usurper, and he took off the 10 tribes to the north because, well, Rehoboam decided he would make things even harder on the people than Solomon had done, out of necessity to maintain that centralized government. The danger of centralized governments. All throughout Scripture recognizes the evils of human oppression. And then you have, of course, not only this despotic rule and the divided kingdom, 1 Kings chapter 12 talks about that. You have the wisdom literature produced by God's inspiration sometime during this period. And in such places as Proverbs chapter 30 and verse 14, there's a warning. There is a generation whose teeth are as swords, and their jaw teeth as knives, to devour the poor from off the earth, and the needy from among men. Many tyrants have found that a way to maintain power, to form an alliance with the rich, and the most powerful will oppress the poorest of the land, take from the poorest who are the least able to defend themselves. Others have done just the opposite, but with the same effect in the end, the same consequence. They have tried to co-opt the rights of the poor, the needs of the poor, but they're not interested in the poor. They're interested in their own power only. And then they take the poor and create enmity against those who have, not necessarily the rich, but those who are just providing for their own, just taking care of the needs of their family. Create envy, jealousy, and enmity, such that there's turmoil, and then they can step in and solve the problem of the anarchy that they have created. In Ecclesiastes 4 and verse 1, Solomon says something. These are sad words, really. So I returned and considered all the oppressions that are done under the sun. And behold, the tears of such as were oppressed, and they had no comforter. And on the side of their oppressors there was power, but they had no comforter. That's not a description of a certain period and a certain place. That's a description of all human history, with some few temporary exceptions, some few. Then we have a foreign oppression that came upon Israel and Judah, especially because of their disobedience. God had warned them, if you rebel against me, I'll allow others to come and take away the freedoms you now have. Stephen talked about this in Acts chapter 7, verses 42 to 43. And he said God allowed them to be taken away because of their sin. So Israel was just too far gone. She lost her sovereignty. What freedom, what independence she had, she lost it because of her sin. A warning for all nations of the world, all cultures. Continued rebellion always brings about that consequence. You lose your independence, you lose your freedom, you lose your sovereignty to others. You are oppressed, and deservedly so. So Judah was punished for 70 years, just as Israel. Israel was obliterated, the northern kingdom, basically. But Judah was intact in Babylonian captivity and then returned to her homeland. And for a while, she did well, and then eventually she got in trouble again because of continued failure to obey God fully. You had the Egyptians, the Ptolemies, who were heirs of the Greek Empire under Alexander the Great, who ruled over Judea for a while. And then you had to the north the Seleucids of Syria, and they were back and forth, holding the boot on the neck of the Judeans. And then Roman rule finally came in 63 BC with Pompey, and they lost their independence completely. And this is the situation when Jesus comes on the scene in the Gospels. So that's a brief history of what we see happening to God's people. Well, we need to go back and ask, what happened? Why did it happen? What can we learn from the big picture? The big picture actually starts in Genesis chapter 3. The beginning of all tyranny, all oppression, started with the sin in the garden. You see, what happened was there was perfect freedom for Adam and Eve, especially Adam, to have direct concourse with God and to talk with God and face to face, to see God in the garden prior to his sin, while he was still in his innocence. But the wicked one, Satan, interposed himself between Adam and Eve and the beautiful relationship that had existed with their God. And they were seduced to sin, did so, and by their disobedience, as a direct consequence, they lost the right to the garden itself, to that freedom they enjoyed in the paradise, and also lost their right to live, to have immortality. That's why death came into the world. That's why we bury our loved ones, and we mourn, and we cry, and we ache over the loss of those who have gone on, and we fear our own demise. That's why it is our affliction today, because of what happened right here. He exercised his dominion over Satan through a lie. Yea, hath God said? The first question, and it was raised by the devil, did God really mean what he said? Creating in her some doubt, as today all tyrants continue to create moral relativistic ideas and political relativism to try to, in some way, tear down absolutes. You see, lies entice us to do wrong. Satan always discourages the truth and knowledge of it. He promotes ignorance, because that leads to more sin. The lie to Eve led to her first fall and to that of Adam. Sin enslaves us, Jesus said, John 8:33-34. It's kind of amusing. The Jews said when Jesus said, you shall know the truth, John 8:32, and the truth shall make you free. And then they brag, we've never been in bondage to any man. Well, wait a minute. You haven't even looked at your own history. That's just not so. You're a bunch of braggarts and you're completely ignoring your past history. Yes, you've been in bondage politically. But more than that, Jesus goes on to say, whosoever sins is the servant of sin. You've committed sin. You are of your father the devil, and the lust of your father you will do. He was a murderer from the beginning, and abode not in the truth, for there is no truth in him. When he speaketh a lie, he speaketh of himself, for he is a liar, and the father of it. All error, all lies go back to the evil one, to Satan, and they're used to enslave. He's the real power. Satan is behind the throne of all tyrannical systems today, all tyrannical systems of yesteryear as well. Whether you're thinking of some ancient Oriental court, some despot, or some modern Marxist regime today, or some modern Neo-Marxist, cultural Marxist takeover of our splendid culture that's happened in our lifetime. However you view it, it's Satan. It's always Satan. Or maybe it's a radical caliphate, Islamic group in some country. Always the same, and it's the same one behind it. Just this morning, Betty and I had to go back and listen again to Mick Jagger and the Rolling Stones song, Sympathy for the Devil. You've all heard that, where he gives this story about how I've been around for a long, long time. He talks about, I was there when Jesus Christ was crucified. Remember that one? And then he goes on to say, I was there when the czars were killed, when Anastasia cried out in pain, one of the czarists of that royal family, when the Bolsheviks, the communists, took over and murdered them. I was there for the Blitzkrieg created by the fascists, other Darwinists of the day under Hitlerism. I was there for all those things. Pleased to meet you. Hope you know my name. What is it? And what's puzzling you is the nature of my game. Well, it might have puzzled Jagger's listeners at the time, but it doesn't puzzle Bible believers. We know the nature of his game. It's oppression. It's the robbing of human freedom and dignity. It's the destruction of mankind. It is to lead us into final destruction. You see, Satan has used many devices, and some of them, most especially, are those seen in history. Social devices are methods, political devices, and religious devices, particularly social, cultural, and religious despotism or tyranny and oppression, all throughout history. You look at every culture that's ever been, and you see Satan's servants, the priests, the shamans, the medicine men, the gurus, the false prophets, the religious leaders of all the ages. And what have they done? They've used deceit. They've used deception, lies to control the masses and oppress the people. And they make themselves look holy and good. Paul talks about this very point I just made in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 13 to 15. Satan transforms himself into an angel of light to appear to be good and holy, the most religious of all, the best in the community. And he's doing the bidding of the devil himself. He's a false apostle. He's not a true apostle. He claims to speak for God, but he's lying, as Satan always has lied. And this is why Paul would write in 2 Corinthians 4 and verse 3, "In whom the God of this world hath blinded the minds of them which believe not, lest the light of the glorious gospel of Christ, who is the image of God, should shine unto them." What a sad commentary on all of humanity when you read that verse. You go back to the prophets of Baal in 1 Kings chapter 18. Elijah alone was the prophet of God in the northern kingdom. He says, the only one left, actually standing up for God's righteousness and truth. There were 450 false prophets of Baal. There were over 400 more prophets of the grove, and all those were taken care of by Jezebel, the wife of the wicked King Ahab. And it was a situation that should have been intolerable, and it was based upon deception. It was quickly exposed at Mount Carmel, where God actually honored the plea of Elijah to bring down fire on the altar to Jehovah, the true God, and all the others were destroyed, all the other false prophets, by Elijah. That was a great day in Israel, but sadly, it did not last. It did not last. And then when we look at the Old Testament, we see God's intent at the beginning of the law was for the Levitical priesthood, the truly ordained priests of that era under the Mosaic dispensation, to represent the people. To represent the people. There's a difference in representing people and in lording it over people. And at the beginning, they followed their role as they should have. Hebrews chapter 5 verses 1 to 4 points out how that those priests were taken from among the people because they suffered the same weaknesses as the people. They could relate to their own people. They had sins, the people had sin, so they could represent them before God. The same also in Hebrews 7 and verse 27. They knew the law, and they were to teach the law to the people. And the people were to teach the law to their children. Deuteronomy chapter 6 verses 6 to 9. They were to teach it incessantly. Why? This grants freedom. This maintains freedom. Freedom from tyranny. Tyranny is sin. Tyranny is sin writ large. And this is what we see when people forget the law of God. But then this good arrangement was perverted. And by the time of Christ, the Sadducees, who were of the priestly school, of the priestly class or caste, had been corrupted. Now the priests are in control, but they don't represent the people. They lord it over God's heritage. They're a ruling, a corrupt caste in Judea. This is just what seems always to happen, degeneration. The Pharisees had the greatest clout, but they weren't actually in control. It's sort of like you had the government, the Sadducees, and the media, the Pharisees. And that duo was a terrible one for the cause of God. Jesus had warned in Matthew 20, verses 25 to 27. You know that the princes of the Gentiles exercise dominion over them, and they that are great exercise authority upon them. But it shall not be so among you. What's the ideal? What's God's will for things? But whosoever will be chief among you, let him be your servant. But this is a far cry from what had happened to the Sadducees. By the time they were so corrupt, they forbade members of the church to speak out in the name of Jesus in the Jerusalem temple area, in the precincts. In Acts 4, verses 18 to 19. They strictly warned them, do not speak. This is what Herbert Marcuse from the 1950s would call repressive tolerance. Tolerance for the left, tolerance for the sinful type, because the left, look, frankly, the left represents sin and its worst manifestations. That's the left. I'm not saying the right politically is always perfect, but the left is evil, wicked to the core. And Marcuse had said, we have tolerance for the speech of the left, no tolerance whatsoever for the speech of the traditionalists, the conservatives, those who stand for biblical morality, Christians who are trying to maintain Western civilization based on Christian culture. Those things must be destroyed. Of course, the watchwords from Peter should resound throughout the centuries, even to us. Acts chapter 5, verse 29. We ought to obey God rather than men. That is an explosive proposition. That is a revolutionary proposition. That's what you call a watershed. You know, the river divides right here and goes in a completely different direction. When you take that rule of life, I will obey God rather than man. That then leads to the possibility of an experiment like this noble one in this wilderness a couple of hundred years ago when our forefathers came over and began this place, this country, in the name of God at that time, however they understood him. But of course, after the New Testament era had begun in the freedom in Christ Jesus, the freedom of the autonomous churches of Christ to govern themselves as per God's way and so on, apostasy, falling away from that standard, was predicted. It was warned it would happen. 1 Timothy 4, 1-3. And it is said, here's how they'll do it. Here's how they'll bring about the demise of pure Christianity. They'll be speaking lies in hypocrisy. They'll have a conscience seared as with a hot iron. Forbidding to marry. Look, power politics in the church. Commanding to abstain from meats. That's in the church. Mr. Big is now in the church. Mr. Big rules over the church. He's imposing religious tyranny over the ignorant, those who allow themselves so to be ruled and to be deceived. The son of perdition is mentioned, 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 2-4. This is a part of that great apostasy predicted. He will be sitting in the temple of God, showing himself to be God. The Pope of Rome claims to be the vicar of Christ, Christ's right-hand man on earth, the very representative of God on earth, to speak in the place of God on the earth. What do you have, of course? Well, it's easy to see how this has developed. And our brother on Sunday mornings has been carefully outlining this for us week by week. We saw how that apostasy gradually developed. There was an increasing hierarchy in the church, vertical control within the church. Power was being concentrated in the hands of just a few. It became a religious oligarchy, rule of the few, especially the rich. Now, after the Emperor Constantine did what we thought was a good thing, after he legalized Christianity in the 4th century, that is in the 300s AD, then Christianity began to be corrupted more and more. Ironically, it began to take on both the forms and the spirit of that old Roman Empire. This can be documented. This is not a wild idea. This can be documented carefully by looking at the developments that took place. The Pope of Rome is nothing more than a religious emperor. Consciously so. He has sought to be like the emperor of that earlier physical empire. The tyranny that was once Rome in all of her glory was also once Greece. It was also once Persia. And it was the tyranny that was once Assyria, that was once Babylon, or the land of Shinar, the kingdom of Nimrod, the archetypical oppressor of all time. It's now the tyranny of false Christianity in our day. It's the tyranny of the secular Marxists and the regimes that they have set up politically, as well as the cultural influence, the rot they've created in our own nation. It's the tyranny of the Muslim fundamentalists who cut off the heads of those who dissent with their point of view and rule with an iron fist. You see, the medieval church, as we've been studying, deliberately kept the masses in ignorance and kept the Bible chained to the pulpit. All their subjects had to be unlearned and not know very much at all, so that they would be forced to go to the priest who was a little more learned than they were on the average, and go through the church hierarchy to get the blessing. It was all channeled through them, funneled through them, to receive absolution, as they call it, or even the very forgiveness of sins. You had to go through the hierarchy. And they were not learning the truth of the Bible. They were learning church teaching in some cases, but not the Bible itself. You see, the Bible is considered dangerous. And it was. It was dangerous to the status quo, to the power structure of the medieval church. Today, we talk about cultural Marxism. And I don't want to get into a history lesson. We don't have time for it, and that's not our real purpose here at a Bible class. But it helps to understand a little bit of history, to kind of see things in perspective. Nothing here is new. You've all come across this a lot lately. But I'll just remind us of some things we have talked about. How, with Darwin's Origin of the Species in 1859, its publication and dissemination throughout the English-speaking world, you had a lot of damage done even in this country. The damage began especially in the university systems. And it trickled down elsewhere. Trickled into the liberal denominations, and you had many of them who became Darwinists, who denied the inspiration of the Bible, denied its literal history in the book of Genesis, denied Genesis chapters 1 to 11, and took on a secular point of view, that all there is, all that really matters, you see, is this world only. Then the social gospel was pushed around the beginning of the 20th century. Things were just right with the liberalism of that time. The great foundations, the great rich people who had made their money in oil and in railroad. You had Rockefeller, for example, who sent millions of dollars to these foundations as well as to the university system to set up teachers he controlled with his money, teachers who were liberal, who were destructive of the old German criticism of the Bible, for example, and who he would take down those who maintained the traditional points of view. Just as George Soros of our time, a communist who came over from Hungary to this country and has destroyed this country, has destroyed Great Britain, nearly brought it to its knees. I think the Brits want to kill him. Putin hates his guts. He's a rival communist. Here's a man who, as a young person, ratted out on his own Jewish brethren, and helped the occupiers of Hungary, the Nazis, to find Jews in their clothes. And he defends that in interviews. When you ask him about rare interviews, by the way, he defends that this is what anybody would do to save his life. What a rat fink. Anyway, that's the kind of billionaire communist that controls our world with no moral compass whatsoever. You had that also in the beginning of the 20th century, is my point. And it made everything just about right. The 1925 Scopes trial in Tennessee, in Dayton, where they made fun of the good people of Tennessee because the Butler Act of that year had forbade the teaching of evolution exclusively. Now, I want you to understand, people misrepresent the Butler Act. It did not forbid the mention of evolution. That's not true. You go back and read it, and I've read the transcripts, I've read the law. The Butler Act was very reasonable. It's basically equal time. Just don't let the atheists come into our school system in Tennessee, where our children who are raised in Sunday school and by Bible-believing parents have to be subjected to that destruction of their faith. Let them hear the other point of view, yeah, but don't have propaganda against Christianity. And of course, the ACLU, even then, back then it was radical, was able to get some people together and bring in some New York troublemakers into Tennessee, into the Bible Belt, and create the 1925 Scopes trial. I'll tell you, the forces of good won the Scopes trial. They won the trial, and they won the argument. Williams Jennings Bryan was not made to look like a fool, as Hollywood later on revised the whole thing in their stupid movie called Inherit the Wind with Spencer Tracy. It's absolutely wrong, and it doesn't fit the facts whatsoever. Not only do you have that time when H.L. Mencken, the iconoclastic newspaper man, came down from the north, from the secularized north into the Bible Belt of the South, and came down to make fun of those people on radio. Radio was in its infancy then, broadcasting the trial day by day. Not only do you have that, in 1933, knuckleheads at Columbia University opened the doors. People like John Dewey. Who's John Dewey? Well, he's a follower of Robert Owen. He's the disciple of Robert Owen. Who's Robert Owen? He's the man who debated Alexander Campbell. He was a socialist of his day, an early socialist in the early 19th century. He wanted communes. He was a hippie before the hippies. Free love, socialism, doling it out, everybody equal, nobody having to worry about the next meal. You know, a utopian ideal. It was a foolish ideal. So John Dewey, the father of American education, was a disciple of Robert Owen. He opens the door of Columbia and other schools to the Frankfurt School, a bunch of Jewish Marxists who were thrown out of Hitler at Germany because Hitler hated those Marxists. You have two scorpions in a bottle, two types of socialism. The National Socialists, who were nationalistic, and the International Socialists, who were the communists. So those two could not have any kind of peace among themselves. They came here to this country with a plan in mind. One of their leaders, of course, Herbert Marcuse, became the great symbol for the hippie movement and all the unrest, campus unrest of the 1960s. They'd go around quoting Mao, Marx, and Marcuse. Really? I've heard the old man speak. He could barely speak English. Yeah, he's gone now. He could barely even speak English with his thick German accent. And he would talk in vague terms, but the man wrote a book on Eros and civilization where he said we need to make love and not war. Let's allow any kind of sexual perversion. Let's tear down the family. Let's destroy the traditional family. Let's destroy the idea of restraint before marriage and the virtues of virginity and things like that. Let's tear it down. This is the lie of the devil. It's the seduction of giving the forbidden fruit for the very same reason, to enslave. And this has been a very successful campaign on their part and that school of radical cultural Marxists of our time. Not just the cultural Marxists, but the actual classical Marxists. We now know the more we open up files from the Soviet Union, the more we look at FBI files under the Freedom of Information Act, just how much damage the Soviets were doing in our country. They were the reason for the hippie movement and saying get out of Vietnam. They were the cause for the campus unrest. They admitted they spent more money, billions of dollars, on that operation, that information operation, as some have called it, rather than on sending aid to their allies in North Vietnam itself. And it was successful. It worked. They said, look how well it worked. The hippies brought this country to its knees. I don't mean just hippies. Actually, you could make a technical difference, say the hippies were the dope smokers in the communes out in the wilderness. But it was the actual troublemakers, the ones who were members of the Students for a Democratic Society, and those sorts of Marxists, avowed Marxists, eventually leading to the terrorists such as the Weathermen, who had their association with our President Barack Obama through some of his people who helped him get into office in Chicago. You have all of that together and you see that they have destroyed this country in a way. But there is a solution. And I'm going to say the solution is not the status quo in the churches now. There's a huge problem in Christendom. And I'm thinking of evangelicals. We know the Catholics where they are, especially under this Pope. Liberation theology. What one guy, I think Brandon House is his name, from Collierville, Tennessee, has called Marxianity, the mixture of Marxism and Christianity, foolish people who don't understand you cannot mix the two. Marxism is militant atheism. It's militant atheism. Socialism is based on those same ideas of taking away freedom and taking away responsibility. Paul said if a man doesn't work, neither should he eat. 2 Thessalonians 3 and verse 10. This is the biblical ideal. You work so that you can eat. You don't have it handed out to you by robbing from those who do work, the rich, to give to the poor. That's not the biblical ideal. So you have Marxianity, and it is being said that this is a major threat to, now notice, not the mainline denominations. You expect the United Methodists, the Presbyterian Church USA, they've been gone for a long time, way out there. You don't expect them. They don't believe the Bible's the inspired Word of God. But evangelicals say the Bible's the inspired Word of God. Now among evangelicals, they're adopting this stuff hook, line, and sinker. The snowflakes, almost all of them, at least 58% of the millennial generation, claim to want to live under some form of socialism, or even fascism, they've said, which is socialism, by the way, another form thereof. They want to live under that. And why is it that we're in this situation? I'm telling you, the churches now are not prepared to deal with it. They cannot. There is only one paradigm that will work. And by paradigm, I mean an overall framework of thought. There's only one way. Notice, the corruption of... Let me tell you, Marxism is just the inversion of Roman Catholicism. Now, that's historically documented. It's the deliberate, conscious attempt to take the principles of the tyranny of the Roman Church, flip them upside down and to rule by secularism rather than by the medieval superstitions of that church. But it's the same desire to rule, to oppress in the same way. The Reformers were able to begin moving away from Rome. Nobly, wonderfully, but they didn't go far enough. They didn't go quite far enough, and then they stopped and they stagnated on the road back to Jerusalem. From Geneva, they stopped, or in Geneva, they stopped in London, and some even remained in Rome. They did not go all the way back to Jerusalem, but some did. Those who believed in primitivism, the idea of restoring primitive Christianity, original Christianity, true Christianity, the only Christianity God recognizes, the Christianity of the book of the New Testament. That's the Christianity that can save the world. That's the truth that can make man free, John 8 and verse 32. A divided Christendom cannot speak with a united voice. It cannot stave off the wolves or the hounds of Marxism. It's too late for that. Only a united Christendom that can unite upon one principle and one principle only, the Bible alone, and the attendant consequence of the right of individual conscience to interpret the Bible. The individual interprets the Bible. They don't interpret it for me. The Reformation moved away from Rome and then it stopped in Geneva. And you have the high churchmen, the robed clergy, who then took upon themselves the same trappings that the Roman bishops had had and the same prerogatives thereof, who now essay to tell us what the church divines meant, what the Bible means to you today. Alexander Campbell was wrong, they say. Why? Because this man came over seeing what was happening in places like Great Britain and Ireland and Scotland, seeing what was going on the continent. And he came back and he said, I'm going to read the Bible as though I'd never read it before. What is wrong with that? Oh, somebody says, that's just a conscious imitation of the philosophy of Francis Bacon, who taught the scientific method, that instead of deducing from the church's propositions about the cosmos what's there, you go out and study on your own and be objective and open-minded. Mr. Campbell said, let's not inherit prejudices from our parents, our fathers. Let's not allow those to guide us in the interpretation of the Bible. Let's put those prejudices aside, what some would call information that's so necessary to understanding the background. Let's put it aside and just read the Bible for itself. Let it speak for itself. Let it show us how to interpret itself. And it does. It shows us how it means to be interpreted. The clues are all here. They're not imposed on it from the clergy of any group, not even Churches of Christ, as though we had any. We don't. It's not imposed on it. It's found in it. And this primitivism, this idea alone, is what can lead to a renaissance and lead to a true restoration. And that's the only thing that's going to save this country now. Ignorance and oppression go hand in hand. Truth and freedom go hand in hand. Charles George wrote in a book called Revolution, European Radicals from Huss to Lenin, back several years ago, the very act of learning in the humanist way, and this is humanism in the good sense of individualism, is revolt. You know, when the tyrants want to keep you in ignorance and you learn something, you are revolting, reaching back in time and across barriers of space to read of and ponder other reality than one's own is to threaten authority, in personal terms at least, of what is. Today they set the standards for what the kids can learn in our public schools, our government schools, that are totally taken over by this false worldview of the Neo-Marxists. And they cannot learn about real American history anymore. That's a threat to the power structure of our time, the truth about how this country was founded. David Daniel wrote in the Bible in English, a 900-page tome, a fascinating book, that Wycliffe, the morning star of the Reformation in England, was able to have such power. And he himself was a threat to the power structure of the Catholic Church. And he says by 1400, the church was sanctioning beliefs and practices that were unbiblical. Remember how we studied about indulgences? Remember? Only trouble could follow that discovery by ordinary people. You take the Bible and put it in their language and they start reading and they go, the church, this is the Bible, this is my church. This is not what I see in the Bible. The priest didn't want them to see that. So it caused trouble, a good kind of trouble. John Huss in Bohemia in the 14th century was a disciple of, very much inspired by Wycliffe from England. Huss taught what's called a radical Christian primitivism. Listen to this. He's considered in that long lineage of rebels to the power structures that are wrong, to the oppressive structures. John Huss of Bohemia, he said that he had above all a vision of true Christianity as, notice, listen, revelation. Simple, universal, overwhelming, personal, and not essentially a mystery commanded by priests. Oh, that's radical. Take the Bible and the Bible only. The people of the English-speaking world have the right to the Bible in their own language, rather than to be forced to listen what their clergy wished them to hear. This is a social leveler. It would destroy the whole edifice of the clerical domination in matters of theology and church life. This translation of the Bible into the language of the people. There was access then by the common man to the Bible, by the individual to the Bible. Remember in Acts 17 and verse 11, they were individually commended. These were more noble than those in Thessalonica in that they received the word with all readiness of mind. Francis Bacon, long before he was ever born, open-minded, and searched the Scriptures daily, whether those things were so. Finding out for themselves. Paul didn't come in and say, wait a minute, what are you doing with those scrolls back there? I told you what's true. Listen to me. That wasn't the apostles' approach. No, he was glad. They were searching the Scriptures to check, to see if the things he said were the truth. And this is the threat to the power structure. Every one of us shall give account of himself to God, Romans 14:12. Not as tribal groups. Not as white people, white Europeans. Not as those from sub-Saharan Africa. Not as those from Latin America, mestizos. Not as Native American Indians. Not as Chinese. We will not give account of ourselves as people groups, but as individuals. This is the horrible thing that happened in the 1960s, when a noble effort for Christianity to be consistently applied and for white people to forget some of the rancor of the past and the politics of the war between the states and to accept black people as on par for the gospel. Some of them were foolish. In the state of Alabama, my father tells me he had an eldership, would not allow a person of color to come into the assembly and to hear the gospel. For crying out loud. You want to take them now across time and shake them. Listen. Let them hear the gospel. What will that do? If you don't like their culture, if you talk about how bad they live the way you think you live, well then give them the Bible and make them better. They are equal in God's sight as individuals in that way. How foolish. Well, that kind of thing caused a reaction. And the communists jumped on it. They jumped right on it. The communists came in and said, here's some enmity that exists in the status quo in the South, not just in the South. Well, let me take that back. It was worse in the North. Far worse, the prejudice of the North against people in the South had learned to have better arrangements, so they worked together, had some concourse together and fellowship. Yes, segregation existed, and yes, it ended up with it having foolish results and reactionary results. The communists came in, co-opted the civil rights movement. And good Christian people couldn't keep up with it. They knew that all are equal in the sight of God. That's true. We shouldn't judge a man on the basis of his skin color, but on the content of his character. Yes, King was right about that. That was true. But then King's ideas were co-opted, and there's some evidence that even while he was alive, some of this was happening. I do listen to a lot of George Wallace tapes from the past, and Mr. Wallace had some nutty things to say, but he also had some interesting things to say that could be documented. No, I don't carry a brief for George Wallace, but I'll say he lived in a time of turmoil when he didn't know how to react in some cases. He could see he kept talking about communists under every rock. He was right. He did not know how right he was, but he warned, and the intellectual elites excoriated him. They looked down on their long noses at him because he said, a central government's dangerous and we need to have power spread out among the states where it's closer to the people. What's wrong with that idea? It goes way back to ancient Israel, as we discussed already. He discussed those kinds of things, but then they thought that's just a code for you wanting to keep people who are of color in their place as you view it and not viewing them as equals in the sight of God. Well, perhaps some of his followers did feel that way. They were wrong. But far worse were the communists who took advantage of it, the socialists of the time, the Neo-Marxists. And now it has gone to seed more than ever in our age, where everything is ethnicity, race, tribalism. We want to all just forget about that and just relate to each other as individual human beings. And I hold you up, and you hold me up to the standard of God's Word, not to the standards of my tribe or culture, but to God's Word. Listen, primitivism of the restoration movement of the churches of Christ is the only solution that's going to work. If we could just get more and more around us to adopt this. This is what we've got to do. We have our work cut out for us, brothers and sisters, to get them to see this is the only way. Early Republican Methodists under James O'Kelly in Virginia and North Carolina started moving in the right direction. They called themselves Christians because that's what you find in the Bible. Others looked at them funny. You're Christians? I thought you were Methodists. Well, we're not going to call ourselves that anymore because that creates a barrier. Let's call ourselves Christians and we can unite on that. You had Abner Jones among the Baptists in New England and Elias Smith, another among the Baptists New England, who wanted to be Christians only. They hadn't gone quite far enough. And then you had some in North Alabama, Bridgeport area, coming out of Tennessee. Many good things are happening in Tennessee, I'll have to say. Coming out of Tennessee into Alabama and establishing churches of Christ before the Campbells ever set foot on this soil from Ireland. There were already churches of Christ there. We know that. That's documented. Our sister Jane, by the way, has relatives that were members of that congregation. What was going on the frontier? They didn't have the robed clergy around all the time to tell them what to think. So what did they do? They committed the horrible sin of reading their Bible for themselves. And as they did, they started seeing New Testament stuff and thinking in New Testament terms, and they became a New Testament people. And the next thing you know, they would call themselves Christians. And we're saying, let's just do what they did in the first century church. We'll talk about one of those things in the plan of salvation, the Lord willing, in our Bible, in our worship hour. The restoration paradigm or worldview is the most consistent way of going back to the primitive times of the apostles. Somebody says, I don't like primitivism. It reminds me of Amish people who ride around in old horse-drawn carriages and things, long beards and clothes from the 19th century. That's not the primitivism we're defending. That's silliness. We're talking about primitivism that makes sense. Because if God only revealed His will for mankind in Jesus Christ and His apostles, that was the end thereof, and no more is coming, and it's not, then everything that has been changed since then is wrong. We've got to go back to the original, the teaching of the apostles in the 27 books of the New Testament. Primitivism is the only solution. True Christianity. That's true Christianity. Not this hodgepodge of Christian ideas out here in all the denominations. And our friends in the largest denomination are close, very close. And they vote well, usually, but not always. But now there are threats of Marxism coming in among many of them. How does this happen? Well, if I don't believe the Bible is the inspired Word of God and completely inerrant, then I think the Spirit guides me into some good ideas today too. I've got my own ideas and I kind of like socialism. Looks to me like a compassionate thing to do so poor people won't go hungry. Paul said if a man doesn't work, neither should he eat. But I don't agree with you, Paul, because you were wrong, Paul. I'm smarter than you are, Paul. This attitude is even in the so-called evangelical churches. But those who consistently say the Bible is right on every point, the Bible, and I'm wrong when I differ from the Bible, are the only ones who can stave off the hounds of the Neo-Marxists and the disintegration of this culture. We need to pray for and work toward a major revival in which we teach the ideal of restoring primitive Christianity. And that will restore the original ideals toward which the founding fathers had been moving, although they weren't quite there. This is the essence of the Puritans and the Separatists who came our way. Any questions or comments? I didn't mean to hog all the time, but if you got any, well, I guess we better ring the bell. Oh, thank you.